The wind carried the scent of iron that morning, the kind that clings to your throat and leaves a taste of rust behind. Sheriff Calloway was the first to spot them, two small figures standing at the edge of the cornfield, barefoot and trembling in the dawn light. Their skin was so pale it almost looked translucent, their eyes glazed and unblinking as if they had seen something they couldn't unsee. The Hargraves children had been missing for 3 days, and yet, there they stood alive, silent, and holding hands so tightly their knuckles had turned white. The youngest, Emily, was humming when they found her. Not a tune anyone recognized, just a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. Beside her, her brother Daniel wouldn't speak. He just pointed back toward the farmhouse down the road, a house that now stood quiet, with its porch light still burning though the electricity had been cut days ago. When the deputies entered the Hargraves' home, the smell hit first. Not decay, not yet, but something sour, earthy, almost sweet. Dinner plates were still on the table, chicken gone cold, glasses half full of milk curdled in the heat. Upstairs, the beds were unmade, clothes scattered, as if the family had left in a hurry. But downstairs, beneath the kitchen floorboards, they found something no one could explain, a trapdoor sealed shut with iron bolts, smeared with ash and something darker. Outside, the children had started crying, not loud, not hysterical, but soft and in unison, their tears falling silently onto the dirt road. Sheriff Calloway would later say it was that moment he realized something was deeply wrong. Because when he asked what had happened, the boy finally spoke. "They came back," he whispered. "Mama said they wouldn't, but they did." And from that morning on, the Hargraves' name became a shadow that hung over the entire county, a story no one dared repeat after dark, not because they didn't believe it, but because they did. It was just past sunrise on June 14, 1975, when two figures emerged from the misty edge of the cornfield off County Road 9. They were children, a boy and a girl, barefoot, dirt streaking their legs, their faces drained of color as though they had been pulled out of a grave. The older boy, around 10, held his sister's hand tightly, his grip firm enough to leave small red marks on her skin. Their movements were slow, almost mechanical, as they drifted toward the roadside like sleepwalkers who had forgotten how to wake up. When a passing milk truck spotted them and screeched to a stop, the driver thought they might be playing a prank. But when he called out, neither child responded. They just stared, blinking slowly, as if the world before them was something they were still trying to remember. The sheriff's office was called within minutes, and by the time deputies arrived, a small crowd had gathered. The girl was shivering despite the humid air, her nightgown torn at the hem, her bare feet cut and blooded from walking. The boy's lips moved, but no words came out. When the deputies approached, he flinched as though the simple act of being touched burned him. He finally whispered his name, Daniel Hargraves. The name sent a ripple through the crowd because the Hargraves family had been missing for days, their sudden disappearance becoming the center of town gossip and quiet dread. The search had already been called off once the summer heat made the woods unbearable and hope began to fade. The children were rushed to the local hospital, where doctors found them severely dehydrated but strangely uninjured. They had no signs of exposure consistent with being lost in the wild for 3 days. No insect bites, no severe sunburns, no scratches beyond their feet. When questioned, the girl, Emily, spoke only in fragments. She said something about a storm, about hearing her mother singing from underneath the floor, and then went silent. The boy refused to speak again. News spread quickly through the small Missouri county. Reporters came, flashing cameras as the sheriff tried to shield the children from questions. The town wanted to believe they had survived something ordinary, a family argument, a runaway incident, anything human. But there was something unnatural about the way they looked, as if whatever had happened hadn't just frightened them but changed them. Their eyes were distant, unfocused, yet there was a strange awareness in them, as though they were listening to something no one else could hear. When asked where their parents were, the boy finally turned to the window and pointed toward the direction of the old Hargraves farmhouse, whispering one word so softly that no one was sure they heard it right, waiting. The Hargraves farmhouse sat at the end of a long, dirt road that wound through the woods like a forgotten scar. When the sheriff's team arrived that morning, fog still clung to the treetops, and the house appeared almost swallowed by the mist. It was a modest 2-story structure, weather-beaten and quiet, its windows reflecting only the pale grey of dawn. From the outside, there was nothing unusual, just a porch swing creaking in the wind and a dog's chain lying in the grass with no dog attached. But as soon as the deputies stepped inside, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. The first thing they noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses down on your chest until every creak of a floorboard sounds like a scream. A half-eaten dinner still sat on the kitchen table: roast chicken, peas, mashed potatoes, 2 plates set, 2 small ones beside them. The food was untouched, the milk glasses half full, the butter knife left mid-slice on a loaf of bread. It was as if the family had stood up in the middle of their meal and vanished before taking another bite. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its hands frozen at 8:47, though no one could explain why it still ran without power. The sheriff's deputy moved through the rooms, calling out names: Martha, Thomas, Daniel, Emily, but only the echo of his voice answered. Upstairs, the parents' bed was neatly made, though the children's beds were unkempt, sheets twisted and damp with sweat. A doll with one missing eye sat upright on the floor, facing the door as if waiting for someone to return. The closet doors were open, clothes still hanging in place, shoes lined neatly beneath. Nothing suggested struggle, yet the air felt heavy, charged, as though the house itself was holding its breath. When one of the deputies opened the back door, the screen banged loudly, making everyone flinch. The garden outside was overgrown, but fresh footprints, bare ones, led from the back steps into the cornfield. They were small and uneven, belonging to children who had run barefoot through the dirt. But there were other prints too, larger, deeper, dragging slightly, as if whoever made them had been pulled or resisted leaving. The trail ended abruptly at the tree line. Inside again, the sheriff stopped at the fireplace, where ashes were still faintly warm, despite no one having tended a fire in days. Nearby, a set of muddy handprints marked the wall, small and smudged, too low to be an adult's. They seemed to lead toward the kitchen, and just beneath the worn linoleum floor, something creaked hollowly when stepped on. The sheriff paused, his hand tightening on his flashlight, and that was the first time he noticed the faint outline of a door beneath his feet, hidden under layers of dust and age. The discovery of the locked cellar beneath the Hargraves' kitchen changed everything. Until that moment, the investigation had been little more than a missing persons case gone strange: a vanished couple, 2 traumatized children, an empty house caught in the thick breath of rural silence. But when the sheriff's boot struck hollow wood beneath the floorboards, and that sharp, echoing sound cut through the room, every man in that house froze. The outline was faint but unmistakable: a rectangular trapdoor, it seems hidden beneath layers of dust and cracked linoleum. They cleared the area, pried up the edges, and revealed what no one expected. The cellar door was bolted shut, not from within, but from above, sealed with 3 heavy iron latches rusted deep into the wood. It was as though someone had wanted to make sure whatever was down there never came back up. The sheriff knelt beside it, running his hand over the bolts. They were old, but not ancient. The metal was dark and cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, unnatural for summer. One deputy remarked that it looked more like a tomb than a cellar. The air above the hatch was still, but carried a faint smell: earthy, wet, and sour, like soil left too long in the dark. When they pressed their ears against the wood, all they heard was silence, but an uneasy kind, one that felt alive in its quiet. The sheriff ordered a crowbar from the truck, but his hands hesitated when he took it. Something about breaking that seal felt wrong, like disturbing something that wanted to stay forgotten. While they waited for tools, one of the younger deputies noticed strange markings near the hinges, carved shallowly into the floorboards. They weren't letters exactly, more like symbols, loops and crosses, and uneven shapes burned into the wood with something hot. No one recognized them, though the sheriff thought they looked like the kind of crude etchings found on barn doors back in the old days, meant to ward off curses. The deputies exchanged nervous glances, muttering that maybe the Hargraves had locked away an animal, a secret still breathing under their house. When the first bolt finally snapped loose, the air shifted. A gust of cold drifted upward, carrying a smell that made everyone step back. The sheriff shone his flashlight into the cracks, but the beam seemed to dissolve before it touched anything solid. He couldn't see the bottom. The cellar was deeper than it should have been, too deep for the foundation of a house that small. The last thing anyone heard before the sheriff ordered it sealed again was a faint, hollow drip echoing up from the darkness, steady, rhythmic, almost like breathing. As word of the Hargraves' disappearance spread, the quiet farming community around Mill Creek began to stir with unease. At first, no one wanted to talk about it. People locked their doors earlier, kept their children close, and told themselves it was just another family gone strange from isolation. But as the days passed and whispers traveled from porch to porch, old memories began to resurface, memories that should have stayed buried. Locals started recalling things they had seen, or thought they had seen, in the weeks before the children were found. There were reports of faint lights flickering near the Hargraves' property at odd hours, sometimes blue, sometimes red, as though fire was burning underground. Others swore they heard voices carrying through the trees, soft and pleading, though no one was ever there when they went to check. A farmhand who lived 2 miles away said he once heard laughter drifting from the Hargraves' fields just before dawn, the kind of laughter that didn't sound human. He'd gone to investigate, thinking it might be trespassers or children playing, but found only trampled stalks and something glinting half-buried in the dirt, a rusted locket with the initials MH engraved on its back. Another neighbor, an old woman named Elsie Turner, claimed she had seen Martha Hargraves walking barefoot through her yard late one night, whispering to herself and carrying what looked like a bundle wrapped in cloth. When Elsie called out to her, Martha stopped, turned, and smiled, but her eyes, she said, looked wrong, wide and glassy, like she was looking through her instead of at her. The sheriff's department began receiving phone calls, most of them dismissed as nonsense, claims of strange noises in the woods, livestock found mutilated, dogs howling at nothing. But one call stood out. A schoolteacher reported that Daniel Hargraves had been drawing disturbing pictures in class weeks before the disappearance. His drawings showed their family home surrounded by dark, shapeless figures with hollow faces. When she asked him what they were, he simply said, "They live in the ground." She assumed it was a child's imagination, until now. People began to avoid the Hargraves road entirely, driving the long way around rather than passing the farm. Even the mailman refused to deliver letters there, saying the last time he approached the house, he heard knocking coming from beneath the porch steps. Whether it was paranoia or something else, the entire county started to feel infected by fear. It wasn't just the mystery of where the Hargraves had gone, it was the sense that something unseen was still there, watching, waiting, and no one wanted to be the next to draw its attention. 2 days after the cellar was discovered, the sheriff's men began searching through the house again, hoping to find something that could explain the family's strange disappearance. It was one of the younger deputies who found it, an old, leather-bound book hidden behind a row of dusty jars in the pantry. The cover was cracked and faded, the pages swollen with age and moisture. When the sheriff flipped it open, he realized it wasn't a ledger or a Bible like he expected. It was a diary, written in a delicate, looping hand that belonged to Martha Hargraves. The first few entries were ordinary notes about the children, recipes, the weather, but as the pages went on, her handwriting began to change. It grew frantic, uneven, as though her hand trembled while writing. At first, the entries spoke of loneliness. Martha wrote about how her husband, Thomas, had grown distant since the move to the new farmhouse, how the nights had become restless, and how the children had started waking up crying without reason. Then came stranger passages, mentions of sounds under the floorboards, the faint rhythm of knocking late at night, the smell of earth creeping through the vents. She described it like something breathing beneath the house, slow and patient. One entry mentioned Daniel waking her up one night, saying he had heard someone calling his name from under the ground. Martha wrote that she searched the cellar door but found nothing, only the sensation that someone was listening from the other side. As the entries continued, her tone shifted from fear to obsession. She began writing about dreams, visions of faces in the soil, voices whispering secrets that she could never remember upon waking. She spoke of an agreement made long before they arrived, something tied to the land itself. One passage mentioned Thomas digging near the old well and finding bones wrapped in cloth, small ones, and how afterward he refused to sleep in the same room. By the final pages, her words had become almost incoherent, scrawled across the paper in blotches of ink and what looked like dried mud. The last entry was dated 3 days before the children were found. The writing was rushed, uneven, with smudges that might have been tears. It read only, "They've come back." Thomas says to seal the door. It won't matter. The ground remembers what it's owed. After that, the rest of the pages were blank, except for faint indentations, like someone had tried to keep writing but couldn't find the strength to press the pen to paper. When the sheriff closed the diary, no one spoke. The silence in that room felt heavier than the air before a storm, and for the first time, he understood why the cellar had been locked from above. The discovery of the drawing came the same day the diary was taken into evidence. It was found in the children's hospital room, crumpled at the foot of Daniel Hargraves' bed. A nurse had given him a box of crayons and paper to help him calm down, but what he produced made her drop the page the moment she saw it. The drawing was done in dark shades of brown, grey, and black, the wax pressed so hard it tore the paper in places. At the center was a crude sketch of the Hargraves farmhouse, drawn with uncanny accuracy for a child his age. The crooked roofline, the lone oak tree, even the broken porch railing were all there. But surrounding the house were shapes, dozens of them, crawling out from the ground like shadows stretching toward the light. They had no faces, only hollow circles where eyes should have been, and long, uneven arms that reached toward the house's foundation. Beneath the drawing, in shaky letters, Daniel had written one word: listening. When the sheriff and the doctors asked him what it meant, he refused to answer. He simply stared at the drawing as if he didn't recognize it anymore, as if someone else had guided his hand. Emily, sitting beside him, began to cry quietly when the picture was shown to her. She said they weren't supposed to draw them, that Mama said it makes them notice. The adults assumed it was trauma speaking, a child's way of processing fear, but when they asked who them was, Emily covered her mouth and shook her head violently. Later that night, she tore up every piece of paper in the room and refused to touch another crayon again. The sheriff took the drawing back to his office and pinned it to the evidence board. He couldn't explain why it unsettled him so deeply, but the image lingered in his mind. The hollow eyes, the stretched hands, the way the figures seemed to move the longer he stared at them. One of the deputies swore the number of shapes around the house had changed since the morning. Another claimed that when the room was silent, he could hear faint scratching from the wall behind it. By evening, the sheriff had locked the drawing away in a sealed evidence box. But that night, he dreamt of it anyway. He dreamt of the farmhouse in the dark, the same field of shapes closing in from all sides, and the same low hum Emily had been whispering when they found her. When he woke, he could still hear it faintly echoing in his head, like something trying to speak from a place deeper than sleep. The night the Hargraves family vanished, a violent thunderstorm tore through Mill Creek, the kind that turned the sky a sickly green and made the earth tremble with every strike of lightning. Most residents remembered that night clearly, not because of the rain, but because of what came with it. Power lines fell, fields flooded, and animals shrieked in their pens as if something unseen was moving among them. Neighbors closest to the Hargraves property later told investigators that they saw flashes of blue light flickering across the fields, brighter than lightning yet eerily still, pulsing from the direction of the farmhouse. One man, Earl Jensen, said he stepped onto his porch around midnight and saw the entire Hargraves field lit up as if the ground itself was glowing. He thought it was ball lightning until he realized the lights weren't moving across the sky, they were rising from the soil. The sheriff's department reviewed the weather reports, which confirmed the storm had been unusually intense. Winds reached nearly 70 miles an hour, trees were ripped from their roots, and several barns across the county were destroyed. But the strangest detail came from the power company records. They showed that the Hargraves property had experienced brief surges of electricity during the storm, pulses that continued even after the power grid failed. The lights in their home had flickered long after the town went dark. When investigators entered the farmhouse days later, the bulbs were still warm to the touch, though the lines outside had been dead since the night of the storm. Neighbors also reported hearing screams that evening, though no one could agree on their source. Some swore it sounded like a woman, others like an animal caught in a trap. One teenager who lived half a mile away said he heard what he thought was singing, low and rhythmic, almost drowned out by the thunder. When the rain stopped, the sound stopped too, and the air afterward felt charged, heavy, and wrong. By morning, smoke was seen rising faintly from the Hargraves chimney even though no fire had been lit for days. What made the night even stranger was what the children later described. When questioned, Emily spoke of lights that came from the ground, moving in slow, rippling waves across the floor of the house. She said her mother told her not to look, that if she did, they'd know she could see them. Daniel refused to speak about that night at all, only repeating that the storm wasn't what scared him, it was what came after, when everything went quiet and something began knocking softly from under the floor. When the sheriff finally gave the order to unseal the cellar, no one wanted to be the first to break the last bolt. The air inside the Hargraves house had grown thick and foul, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Every man in that kitchen felt it, that sense that once the door was opened, something would change for good. When the final latch came loose, the wood groaned like a living thing. A rush of cold air poured out, damp and heavy, carrying a stench that made the deputies stagger back. The smell wasn't just rot, it was older, deeper, like earth with blood. The flashlight beams trembled as they reached into the darkness below. The cellar steps were steep and slick, leading down into a space that seemed far larger than the foundation should have allowed. At first, they saw only dirt and debris, jars of preserves smashed along the walls, and old farming tools rusted through. But when one of the deputies moved further in, his light caught something that made his breath hitch, a wooden box, crudely built, half buried in the soil. Then another, and another. There were at least 6 of them, stacked unevenly, covered in a thin layer of earth and straw. The boxes looked like coffins, but far too small, as if built in haste by someone desperate to hide them. When they pried the lid off the first one, what lay inside wasn't human remains as expected, it was soil, packed tightly and damp, mixed with something that looked like hair. The next box held something worse, a small skeleton wrapped in fabric that had once been white, its bones faintly stained with something dark. Panic rippled through the deputies. Some refused to continue. Others tried to rationalize, saying they must have stumbled on an old burial from the property's previous owners. But when they found the last box, partially open, every voice fell silent. Inside was a shape that shouldn't have been there, something human in form but wrong in its proportions, its limbs twisted as if it had been buried alive and clawed at the lid until its fingers splintered. The sheriff forced himself to look closer, and that was when he noticed something impossible. The figure was wet, the dirt around it freshly disturbed, as though it had been moved or had moved on its own. He ordered the cellar sealed immediately, his voice shaking as he barked the command. Before the men left, one of them swore he heard a faint scratching from one of the unopened boxes, so soft it could have been the settling of wood or something inside, still trying to get out. Nearly 30 years passed before anyone dared set foot on the Hargraves property again. By then, the farmhouse had collapsed into itself, the roof caved in, the windows shattered, and the fields long since overtaken by weeds. The story had become local legend, whispered at bars and told to children as a warning about what happens when you dig where you shouldn't. But the return of Daniel Hargraves in the summer of 2004 changed that silence. He arrived unannounced, driving an old pickup with out-of-state plates, his face drawn and hollow, his hair streaked with grey though he couldn't have been more than 40. No one recognized him at first until he said his name. Then the entire town seemed to stop. The last surviving Hargraves child had come home. Daniel spoke little to the press and refused interviews. He rented a room above the diner in town and spent his days alone, often walking the long road out toward his family's ruined farm. People said he would stand at the edge of the field for hours without moving, staring at the spot where the house used to stand. When someone tried to talk to him, he would only say he was trying to set things right. The sheriff's department, led now by the son of the original investigator, kept an eye on him but saw nothing illegal in his behavior. Still, there was something about him that unsettled everyone. He looked like a man who had seen the edge of something the rest of the world wasn't meant to glimpse and had barely returned from it. One night, Daniel asked for permission to visit what was left of the property. Against better judgment, the sheriff agreed, sending 2 deputies to accompany him. They described the visit later in hushed tones. Daniel walked through the wreckage without hesitation, stopping where the kitchen would have been, where the cellar once lay hidden beneath the floor. He stood there in silence, then knelt, pressing his hand to the earth as if listening. When one of the deputies asked what he was doing, he simply said, "They're still here." The next morning, he was gone. His truck remained parked by the road, but there were no footprints leading away from it, only a patch of disturbed soil where the cellar had once been sealed. When the deputies approached, they swore the ground looked freshly turned, though no one had touched it in decades. Later that week, the sheriff's office received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper, smeared with dirt and bearing Daniel's handwriting. It contained only 4 words: the debt was paid. When Daniel Hargraves resurfaced one final time, it was nearly 6 months after his disappearance from the old property. A hunter found him wandering along the edge of Mill Creek Forest at dawn, barefoot and covered in mud, his clothes torn and his eyes blank with exhaustion. He was taken to the hospital in near catatonic silence, muttering words that made little sense to anyone who heard them. At first, doctors assumed he had suffered a breakdown, but as fragments of his memory began to return, it became clear that whatever he had seen beneath that land had shattered him in ways no illness could explain. When the sheriff came to question him, Daniel asked for the room's lights to be dimmed, saying the brightness made them move closer. Only then did he begin to speak about that night, the night his family vanished and what he claimed had been waiting for them beneath their home. He told the sheriff that the land was not cursed in the way people believed, it was bound, kept sealed by something his parents had disturbed. His father, Thomas, had been trying to dig a new well when he unearthed an opening that led far deeper than any well should go. He heard sounds down there, like whispers rising through the soil, and after that, nothing in the house was the same. The children began to dream of faces in the ground, and Martha started hearing her name whispered from beneath the floorboards. Daniel said that his parents tried to close it, to seal it with iron and prayer, but the storm that night tore everything open. He remembered the blue lights flickering through the cracks in the floor, the hum that made the walls vibrate, and his mother's voice telling him not to look no matter what he heard. But he did look, and what he saw wasn't the faces from his dreams, it was the ground itself shifting, breathing, as if alive. When the sheriff asked what happened next, Daniel said that his mother told him to run, that she and his father would put them back to rest. He remembered her standing over the cellar door with the Bible in one hand and a hammer in the other before the lights went out. Everything after that was darkness and sound, knocking, crying, and something dragging itself up from below. He claimed that what lived under their land wasn't meant to be seen by anyone alive, that it belonged to the earth and had only been waiting for the right moment to be remembered. His final words before falling silent were barely a whisper: "We didn't bury them. They buried us." After that, Daniel never spoke again, and the Hargraves property was sealed under government order, fenced off and left to rot, its secrets swallowed once more by the soil.